welcoming you to episode 93 of Sport Shorts. And today our guest is Alana Hernandez, who is the EVP of Business Affairs and Operation Team Sports at Wasserman, and more importantly, a new board member of the Sports Lawyers Association. Welcome, Alana.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you. Our program always starts out in the same way. We've just announced what your title is, but what, if you wouldn't mind, what is it? What is it actually that you do? What is your job? Tell us a little bit about your day to day. And then also, what was the path that you took to end up in the agency world?
It's actually funny to answer the question, what do you do day to day? Because it really feels like every day is different. Currently, in this role, I oversee our entire legal team for our sports talent division, mostly focused on North America and some international basketball, international hockey, but mostly in North America. And we have a team of about four lawyers who do the day-to-day legal stuff. So look at the contracts, review team deals, endorsement, appearances. We also have creators that we work with now. And so team of lawyers works and makes sure that all those agreements are good. So I oversee that. I do very little of the day-to-day contract work, although that's what I focused on when I started. And outside of that, a lot of my job is on the operations side. So ensuring the internal functions of the group are managed well, working with all of the other platforms that we have in the company. So interfacing with brands and properties, interfacing with music, Burlstein, working with our finance and accounting teams and our corporate legal team. So just making sure that we can connect the dots internally. We're now a company of over 3,500 employees. It's about 10 times larger than when I started at Wasserman back in 2013. So lots of moving parts, and we definitely have to make sure that we have good operations. And then another part of my job that I spend a lot of time on actually over the last 6 or 7 years is the growth of our talent practice. So I will work with our M&A council on all of the acquisitions that we do. So starting back in 2018 when we acquired our first major football practice and then got into hockey. And then from there all the way until our most recent acquisition on the sports side in the US was, or on, I guess, the sports talent side in the US was our acquisition of Long Haul Management, another creator agency. So managing those deals, helping with the organization and the integration of those companies into the Wasserman platform. So all of that takes time. Every day really is different. And yeah, I think that's what I love about the job is just being able to work with so many different people and then having both the legal and the business side of things that I'm able to work on.
Well, you used one expression there that I'd like you to explain a little bit because some people aren't really sure what it means. And it's a phrase that's thrown around a lot lately. And you referenced creator agency. And that is a growth area. I know that just in my world, my son, who's also a lawyer, that's his entire practice.
Oh,
But
wow.
but can you talk a little bit about what that really means, what that is?
Everything that we see on social media with people that have hundreds of thousands, maybe even less than that, and they're doing brand campaigns and interfacing with brands, those are digital creators. They have made a brand for themselves, a name for themselves. They're an entire business. Some of them do more than just the social media posts. They might have events that they host. They might have product lines that they're launching. So that's a whole different world for us. And we've realized that our traditional athletes are interested in that in some way, shape, or form. And so we wanted to be expert in being able to provide that service to them. But this was a whole different line of business that we really saw has elevated in the last handful of years. I mean, like I said, when I started in Wasserman 11 years ago, it was like social media and digital was just minor, very minor of what our athletes were asked to do. Now an entire deal could be a social media deal. So the creators that we represent, they run the gamut: beauty, fashion, travel, lifestyle, family, diversity. We long haul management focuses more on like the sports and digital gaming creators, and so there are so many different categories of what a creator can be. And I think that's also what makes it interesting is that there really isn't a limit. It's kind of like what do people care about, and then okay, are there other people that care about that, and it can make an entire business around that.
Which raises a really interesting question when you're representing talent,
Hmm.
particularly professional athletes who, in many respects, have already created their brand as an athlete, but they want to get engaged in sort of promoting themselves through social media. Do you train them or do you let them just rip? I mean, that can be a very scary place to be.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, our most of our athlete clients, and I would say probably most athlete clients, outside of the now collegiate athletes in the NIL space, are not natural creators because they didn't grow up having to do that, or having to focus on that as part of their business. So there's very little that we really spend time doing because it does take a lot of time to kind of get somebody to a point where they can have a whole YouTube series themselves, or really put out content a couple times a day or at least every day. And so that's challenging. They do have other things that they focus on. So there's a handful of our athlete clients that are really good at it and willing to invest the extra time to become good at it. But it is a full-time job. So, you're not going to find most professional athletes spending a whole lot of time focusing on the creator stuff unless they're like nearing the end of their professional career and kind of thinking about what are they going to do next.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because so many people out there, I'm not talking about athletes, I'm just talking about the consuming public,
Hmm.
they see this and they say, oh, look, so and so athletes posted this about what they did here. And I don't think people realize that it's not just point a camera and record.
Right.
And and it's also about, I think part of your role is advising these athletes that it's a lot of work and you can't just put it up there. There has to be a plan. And I
Right.
think because of people, especially younger athletes that have grown up in a native digital environment, they think whatever you put out there works. That's not necessarily so, is it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our creator clients have people on staff. They have an editor. They have their videographer that's really capturing the content. And then, I mean, because it also takes time to edit it and to make it social media appropriate. You might have content that's 15 minutes long, but nobody's going to sit and watch 15 minutes on, Instagram or TikTok. You really have to, dilute it to a way that people can digest it easily. And so there's a lot that goes into that. And unless an athlete is going to have somebody on their team that's sort of following them around, understands the art of it and understands the tech of it, it's going to be really hard for them to spend all their time doing it.
Yeah, and that must be a kit glove approach with an athlete telling them that, well, it's really a great idea, but dot 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 dot.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just have to give them the lay of the land. That's our job, anyway, is to just sort of say, this is what this means. Are you willing to do this? Can you do this? Do you have the time to do it? So that's why I think you'll find most athletes are doing, the one-off posts here and there, um, either around a particular campaign or they, let's say they have a deal with the shoe and apparel company. Well, they'll naturally post themselves wearing those sorts of things, but it's not necessarily trying to tell a story about what's going on. And I think that's one of the things that might differentiate some of the creators from our traditional athlete creators is just the intensity of what they're doing, the intensity of what they're telling, and it's not just a day in the life kind of a thing.
Which is really an interesting point because so many of the deals that I've done over the last, I don't know, 10 years, 8 years, who knows how many years, but in the relatively recent past, where clients done a deal for either a television commercial or some sort of promotional event, that one of the deliverables is social media posts.
Hmm.
We want to be posted here and you have to do so many stories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a negotiated point that you have to really focus on because is your client really going to do this? Or are you going to have to get them to hire somebody? When you're dealing with those kinds of deliverables, is there more pushback, or do you just have to accept it these days that that's part of the deal?
There isn't usually pushback on the idea of doing social media. There might be pushback on the frequency of it or how many have to go out, because what we don't want is um, for it to look unnatural on social media. Nobody wants that. The consumer doesn't want that. The client doesn't want that, and we don't want that. So, and the brand doesn't want that. So we have to really have a discussion about what does the talent do normally on social media, and how can this fit sort of easily and seamlessly within their normal cadence of posting and what they post about and how they post, so that it looks really natural. So that's usually the conversation. I think everybody at this point understands, well, social media is going to be part of it, assuming that the athlete even really has a social account. And I think most athletes do, but you do still have a few holdovers who like don't really use it at all. And we're like, oh, well, let's think of something else that they can do, because that's
Yeah.
not that's not going to work.
Oh, I know that. I've run into that situation, and I explain this. Well, my client doesn't have any social media presence, which is usually met by a what? What do you mean?
Right, right,
And I say
right.
they don't. And I've done a lot of deals where we just simply say, look, you can take some amount of the content you've recorded and you can
Hmm.
put it up on your sites, subject to whatever guardrails we want to put around it, so that
Correct.
social media taste is given to the brand.
Right, and that's also something that we see a lot is if our social clients do have social media posts, reposting collaboration posts between the brand and the athlete, so you get that extra engagement, and fans start to follow the brand who will only follow the athlete, and vice versa. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways you can think about it, but I think for the most part, people have social media these days.
For better or worse, yeah, they
Right,
do.
right,
And I know we've gotten down the road a little bit, and you've talking about how diverse your job is and how many different hats you get to wear, which is the best way to have a job because you're never going to get bored. But
right.
let's backtrack a little bit. And how were you so lucky to get to where you are? What was your path to ending up at Wasserman? I'm sure it's as
Um,
typical as everyone else's.
Right. I was going to say it's the same as everyone's. You didn't really see yourself here and you kind of ended up. Yeah. So, for better or worse, I didn't know that a lawyer could work in sports. This was not on my radar when I was trying to, get myself into law school. And I was really thinking about working in the government or working in a nonprofit or, something like that. I knew entertainment existed. My dad is actually an entertainment lawyer. So I knew that that was a path that someone could take. But I don't recall that my law school really had any offerings or clinics or classes on what it would be to work in sports as an attorney. And so when I was in law school, I didn't focus on this at all. I didn't do any internships. And I don't know that at the time, agencies or teams or leagues or brands were hiring interns in the legal department. Um, and I didn't even look. And so it wasn't until a couple of years after I started practicing litigation at the law firm in New York, Weil, Gotshal and Manges, that I realized, well, this firm actually represents the players' unions and they will negotiate collective bargaining. And if there's a lockout, they're in there and they're in their room and they're trying to help, figure out and navigate the situation. I thought that was fascinating. I had never heard of anything like that before. And so couple of the lawyers that I was actually working with on other cases were very intimately involved in this process and had been for years at the firm. So I started to pick their brains and learned a little bit about the process from them, and who do they know, who should I talk to, how should I educate myself. And it was really through that I started to kind of go to some of the sports law symposiums that were held. I was still living in New York at the time, and Fordham Law has a great one, so I went to that a couple times and met some really interesting people. And then it really was just the job at Wasserman popped up on the radar of a partner that I was working with, Bruce Meyer, who now is head of collective bargaining at the MLBPA. And he and I were very close. I considered him a mentor and still do. And he just said, I know you're from Los Angeles. I know that you like sports and you might want to take this job. Are you interested in talking to them about it? I was like, okay, sure. Having never done anything in sports, I was a litigator. I was not a transactional lawyer. And so that was how it happened. And I was able to, talk my way through the interview as to why it would be helpful for a litigator to come in and advise on the transactional space, I had to be able to bridge that gap. What I really think is the takeaway is you have to do good work, first of all, no matter what you're doing. You have to learn legal skills, learn true legal skills that you can apply anywhere, which is what I did when I was at Weil. And you have to make connections and keep connections and make sure that if somebody is going to recommend you for a position, that you're not going to, make them wish they didn't recommend you. So I think a lot of it is the relationship part. What I'm doing is not rocket science. I love it. I think it's a lot of fun. There are sometimes really challenging things that we're dealing with, but it's something that can be learned. I've learned it. I'm still learning every single day. There's something that I get to learn differently because the industry is shifting, and we're all sort of trying to navigate our way through some of these new issues. Um, but that's oftentimes how it happens for a lot of people. You're kind of in the right place and at the right time, and you've made a connection with one person or two people who happen to remember who you are and really liked you as a person. Integrity, I think, is really, really, really important in this industry. It's a very small industry. And if people like who you are as a person, even if they've had to negotiate with you across the table, there are going to be so many opportunities that can come your way, whether from a business, professional, personal standpoint.
Well, you've raised, broadly speaking, two topics that come across this program often. The first is why litigators make such damn good transactional lawyers. And I've often said it's because when you're doing business litigation in particular, you look at this set of facts and you go, if they had a better contract, they would have had a way to resolve this, or this wouldn't have happened. So when you
Right.
start doing transactional deals, you have some background to know how to protect your client. So if
Mm-hmm.
you're a litigator and say, how am I ever going to get into this? You're getting into it because you're understanding the process. So I
Right.
think that's a truth. And then secondly, and far more importantly, is you get out of law school, you get this tool belt, you got to figure out how to use all the tools. But the one
Mm-hmm.
tool they really don't um, focus on in law school is the tool called relationships. And I think that what you just said is critically important. Who do you meet? How do you meet them? And if you don't meet people and experience things, that serendipitous moment is not going to happen for you. So you
Right.
can't live in your no blinders world and this is my job and this is what I'm doing. You have to sort of be in a position to look around and find something. And as you pointed out, you're, big New York law firm litigator, and then you go into the sports business in LA. How does that happen? Well, you just gave a perfect example of how that happens. It was a relationship that led to an
Right.
introduction that led to a job.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I can say the same thing about interns that I've had and where they've ended up and how they've ended up there with the opportunities that one would think on paper, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But that's just sort of the world that we're in.
Well, and I also think that the relationship part is really important in the transactional space, the kind of work you do and I do, is
Hmm.
that this isn't like a litigation where, unless you're doing antitrust litigation, it's a small pool of people who are going to always be seeing each other. In this business, you're going to do deals with the same people over and over and over and over
Correct.
again.
Yeah.
And if you don't build a decent relationship, life gets really complicated when it doesn't
Right.
need to be. So I
Right.
think that's an important skill set that you need to have is,
Hmm.
as you pointed out, the integrity so that when you say this is a blue car, people are going to go, yeah, it's a blue car. We know she's speaking the truth.
Right. And it's okay for, I think, you to be a tough negotiator, but you don't have to
Oh
be a
yeah.
jerk.
I use another word, but we'll go with jerk. One of the other things that I want to talk to you about is, you've talked a lot about, that you lead this legal group and talent negotiations and that whole part of the practice at Wasserman. But one of the things you also mentioned is over the last 4 or 5 years, Wasserman has been in, I guess you'd call it an expansion mode, buying up other practices, both foreign and domestic. How does that differ, those kinds of negotiations, as opposed to doing a talent deal? Or is there really a difference?
Um, there is a difference because we are not just talking about one person and one brand, and hopefully a long-term relationship between those two, and kind of how do you everybody on the same page in terms of the synergies that the talent and the brand can have. And I think a lot of our negotiations on the talent deals end up being, well, everybody really wants this to work because the client really loves these products. You guys really love the client. So that's easy. And we're going to figure that out. And there isn't usually anything that kills a deal. Very few things will kill a talent deal with a brand. With the transactions, you're not just dealing with a brand, Wasserman, and a new company that we're buying. You're dealing with all the employees that come along, making sure that we're not going to, or that the sellers feel comfortable that we're not going to completely change the way that they do business and that they represent their clients when they come in. That they understand our HR policies, that they like the way that our platform is set up. So it's much more of a intimate marriage, I think, when you're talking about the M&A deal, that we're not just buying products. We're hoping that the clients come with the company that we're buying. We're hoping that the employees come and they stay and they really want to be here, because ultimately, this kind of acquisition that we're doing, at least on the sports talent side of the business, if the employees don't stay, then the clients probably aren't going to stay, because that's where the relationships are. So you really have to think about how you make people excited to not only want to come, but to want to stay. And that's a little bit challenging to think about it, 8 years in advance, when you're trying to see if there's synergy. Not just that there are synergies, but that culturally this is going to work. That everybody is really going to want to work together. We're going to want to grow and build something. So there are a lot more nuances that you really have to think through. And it's hard yes, we have to say, well, this is a non-negotiable for us. Like, we can't change this one thing in the deal. But then you also have to realize that, well, they're, your people, these are people that are coming on board. So you have to be a little bit flexible in how you're having those negotiations. And you don't want to be like too tough in certain things, because you want these people to want to work here at the end of the day. So you don't want to create like an adversarial relationship. So it's probably almost like negotiating like a prenup. Like, you're trying to protect the parties before you get into a marriage that you hope is going to last forever. So that's really what we're dealing with. So the nuances are a little bit challenging sometimes. And, we've had all sorts of issues come up in those negotiations that we don't necessarily plan for, because we're like, well, we didn't think that would happen, but we're also not surprised because that's the kind of deal that we're dealing with.
One of the principles, the goals of the Sports Lawyers Association is our initiative regarding DE&I. And it's an important issue for all of society. But in your world, it has historically been let's say, a small set of folks involved in the enterprise. But as we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, that's changing in many ways. What are Wasserman's goal in that space with respect to engaging a more diverse core of agents representing talent, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think Wasserman has, for a long time, been at the forefront of that. We were the first, if not one of the first, to really have a practice focused on women's sports. And so diversity from that perspective has always been top of mind. We've always been setting the standard in terms of that. I think our company is very well balanced between men and women, including women in leadership positions across the company. And so I think from that perspective, on the D&I front, we're doing really well. When it comes to agents and employees of color, I think we're also doing well. We have our group is focused on really trying to put ourselves in the places where we need to be to attract the talent that we're trying to attract. And the problem is not that, people of diverse backgrounds were previously not qualified for these positions. They just didn't really have access. I mean, I think before we were going to or having relationships with organizations like diverse representation or minorities in sports. We, we're hoping that the candidates would come to us. Well, we have to go to the candidates. We have to go where people are that are interested and maybe just don't know or have the opportunity to introduce themselves to us. And so I think that's been the focus for us, is really in what rooms do we need to be in to then give people access to then being in our rooms. And it's hugely important, like you said, to make sure we're focused on that diversity and inclusion, because the clients that we represent are incredibly diverse. We represent people from all over the world, from every single kind of socioeconomic background, different religions, different cultures. And if we have everybody that's working with them that looks the same, that's not going to be interesting. That's not going to allow us to really represent them in the best way with brands, with teams. We're trying to tell a story that's culturally relevant. We're trying to keep our clients culturally relevant. And if we, have everybody that looks the same, it's just not going to be an interesting conversation. We're not going to be able to move ourselves forward or our business forward.
Well, you touched upon with it's a perfect segue to my next topic, which is moving going from diversity broadly into women's sports in particular. And what I'd like to sort of focus on a little bit more is name, image, and likeness for collegiate athletes that just so happen to be women. Because I think so much of the noise is about the starting quarterbacks of major college programs, money being paid. But women's basketball, for one example, is one of the three premium drivers of college sports. And now we've seen with what's going on in the WNBA, and I
Mm-hmm.
can't wait to see what happens with their new bargaining now that they've opted out. The National Women's Soccer League, the Women's Hockey League. These are big changes in the sort of the women's pool of sports. How are you guys focusing on getting that, leveling that up? Because, for example, under the current bargaining agreement in the WNBA, the max a player can get on salary is barely above the minimum of an NBA salary. So I see there's changes there. How are you guys working in that space?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of education. We have to, and that this is something that the collective group of Wasserman does, is education and research, and making sure that the people who are making these decisions understand the value of women and the dollars that are coming in, not just because of women athletes being really interesting, but they drive revenue, they drive engagement, they drive fans. People are connected to women athletes in a way that they're not connected to male athletes. It's just different, and the women athletes connect with their fans in a different way. So being able to continue to educate the people that are holding the purse strings, that are then going into the negotiations with their media partners as to how much revenue should really be coming in, and then how can we better share that revenue with the players. They need to have that information in order for them to make a decision that hopefully is going to be, fair in our opinion, and for the athletes. And so I think that that's one thing. And then the other thing is um, just trying to make sure that we can help organizations like the WNBA understand how they can better market themselves to then drive more revenue to their organizations. I mean, we're not necessarily like hired to do that, but I think in the conversations that we have with them, in the rooms that we're in with them, like, let's all try to do this together. The players are doing their part in getting the people to come here. How about leagues? Let's do your part. Teams, let's do your part. And some teams have done really well at this, and other teams are just kind of catching up, and other leagues are just kind of catching up. So it really is an education piece in terms of how to drive, not just drive eyeballs, but drive revenue. And then how do you stay in all the people who are trying to consume the content.
You know, Specifically talking about NIL for a minute, if you don't mind, we're not quite 3.5 years into the real world of NIL. How do you see those deals changing, particularly with respect to women's sports, women collegiate athletes?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you have for some sports, the collectives are entering into the same types of relationships with the top players as they are with like the quarterbacks. Maybe not the same dollar amount, but the thing that I think is going to be the most interesting is how that changes, if at all, when we get to a point where we understand our student athletes employees, how is revenue going to be shared with the student athletes, are all the sports going to be able to stick around because of this new revenue sharing model that the settlement will allow. And so I mean, while we do see at this point that there are massive opportunities for NIL athletes, including women athletes. I mean, some of the top NIL earners happen to be women, and are in some sports that are not necessarily like the most consumed in streaming or television because we just don't have access to all of them. But I think there are a lot of still going to be a lot of opportunities with the brands, but it might depend on some of these other factors and how we're going to determine at the end of the day what is the revenue that these players are actually going to be able to earn from the schools, from the collectives, and will any of that offset each other?
Yeah, it's very interesting because we're at a point now where the NIL world has changed the face of college sports. I don't think
Hmm.
anybody's going to question that. And when you combine that with the transfer portal, unlike professional sports, there seems to be a new age of free agency in collegiate athletics.
Yeah.
And none of us know where it's going, but it's keeping all of us on our toes. That's for darn sure.
Right. Right.
Anyway, look, I'm not going to keep you any longer. I know you're very busy, but I really appreciate your taking the time this morning
Yeah. Of course.
to
Thank
chat
you.
with us and tell us a little bit about your experience and what you're doing. For everyone else, November 7th, Fall Symposium, Sports Lawyers Association, New Orleans, Louisiana. Sign up. It's going to be a great event, as all of our events are. And it's that time of the year to renew your membership with Sports Lawyers Association. So go to sportslaw.org and renew. And if you're not a member, well, why not? Join the SLA. It's a great organization. Anyway, thank you all for tuning in. And Alana, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really
Of
appreciate it.
course. Yeah. Loved it. Loved the conversation. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks.